I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to the China Global Podcast. Concern about the possibility of a Chinese attack against Taiwan has surged in recent years. Wargames and research studies have focused primarily on identifying gaps in U.S. and allied capabilities with the goal of strengthening deterrence. A relatively understudied question, however, is the potential consequences for China if a military operation against Taiwan were to fail. To address this gap, the German Marshall Fund led a study of the possible costs that China would incur against 4 different but interrelated areas: the Chinese economy, the military, Chinese social stability, and the international costs. GMF commissioned 4 papers on these key areas, and we considered 2 scenarios that could realistically take place in the next 5 years. In the first scenario, a minor skirmish escalates into a multi-week maritime blockade of Taiwan by China. And although several dozen members of the Chinese and Taiwanese military are killed, U.S. intervention eventually forces China to de-escalate. In the second scenario, a conflict escalates into a full-fledged invasion, with Chinese strikes on not only Taiwan, but also U.S. forces in Japan and Guam. And after several months of heavy fighting, Chinese forces are degraded and eventually withdraw after suffering many tens of thousands of casualties. So the authors in this study found that the cost to China of a failed military action against Taiwan would likely be considerable. We believe their findings are important and warrant wide dissemination. And in this podcast, we'll discuss the report's major conclusions and its implications. And then we'll talk about the potential impact of a failed Chinese attempt to take Taiwan on China's military capabilities and on the possible international costs that Beijing could face. And that's 2 of the 4 papers in the study. So our next 2 China Global podcasts will examine the implications of a failed military operation against Taiwan for China's economy and its social stability. My 2 guests today are Zack Cooper and Joel Wuthnow. Zack is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a lecturer at Princeton University. And Joel is a senior research fellow in the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs within the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Joel's paper and this interview reflect only his personal views and not those of the National Defense University, the Department of War, or the U.S. government. So let's get started. Welcome both of you to the China Global Podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks, Bonnie.
Thanks, Bonnie. Good to see you.
So I'd like to start with you, Zack. Our findings indicate that a military conflict over Taiwan would likely have really grave consequences for China. They include economic disruption and decline, catastrophic military losses in the case of the major conflict scenario. Significant social unrest is a possibility, and also devastating sanctions. So what are the implications of these findings for China, the United States, and Taiwan?
Well, I think one thing that we all identified is that the costs to China are across all of these 4 areas, and they're very significant. Now, of course, I know at the end we'll probably talk about whether they might be significant enough to deter Xi Jinping from taking an action in the first place. And I don't think we were really trying to assess necessarily whether Xi Jinping would act or not. We were really just trying to look at the costs themselves. But what surprised me in this project is just how significant some of these costs are, even in areas where, frankly, I was a little bit skeptical. So the diplomatic costs, which is the part of the paper that I wrote, I thought the costs were probably going to be pretty limited. And actually, when you look at the major war, I think the costs are serious. And that was true across all of these papers. So the 2 of the big takeaways that I had is, one is that there's a discontinuous increase, a nonlinear increase in the cost that China might face when you look at a minor skirmish compared to a major war, a major conflict. The costs go up very, very quickly, and they may jump depending on the severity of the conflict or the amount of time that it goes on or the countries that are involved from the outside. The other major takeaway I had is that I think we all spend a lot of time looking at scenarios in which the US doesn't do well or Taiwan doesn't do well. And that's natural because we're trying to test out the weaknesses of our own approaches. But we almost never talk about scenarios in which China doesn't do well. And we all know that failure is an option, and amphibious operations are incredibly risky. And we don't hear a lot coming out of Beijing about their own war games, about what would happen if they failed at their operations. And so I think it was really useful to try and think about this from the other side and realize all of the risks that leaders in Beijing would have to face.
Right. And of course, one of the caveats that we make in this report is that even if the costs are very, very high, Xi Jinping may feel that he has to act anyway if he thinks that failure to act against Taiwan might jeopardize his position, the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. So the cost could be very high, and that actually might not deter him. And that's something everybody should, of course, understand. So in the report's conclusion, you wrote, for deterrence to hold, policymakers in Taipei and Washington and elsewhere must demonstrate to Beijing that they're capable of rebuffing a Chinese military operation and that they are committed to doing so that the costs, again, of a failed conflict are substantial and that there are better alternatives to starting a war. So I found that really interesting. Maybe you can give us some concrete examples of actions that need to be taken in order to strengthen deterrence.
Sure. I think often when we talk about deterrence, especially today, there's a focus on deterrence by denial, right? Preventing your opponent from being able to do the thing that they're trying to do. But in a lot of the areas that we were looking at, deterrence by punishment is sort of more relevant, right? So if you're thinking about the economic costs of an operation against Taiwan, you can't use those costs to deny China the ability to take Taiwan. But this is really about deterrence by punishment, making the cost of that operation so clear. So efforts by members of Congress, for example, or other international leaders to demonstrate to China that an operation against Taiwan would have massive economic consequences for Beijing, I think that could potentially be a useful deterrent threat. Similarly, actions in the diplomatic realm to demonstrate that there would be a real international response, of course, not by every country, but maybe by some critical countries, especially in East Asia or perhaps even Europe, that could be useful as well. And I don't want to suggest, and I don't think any of us believe that those would determine what Xi Jinping would do on their own. But, Xi Jinping will have a lot of very complex decisions to make if he decides to take a military action against Taiwan. And I think just complicating that decision is an important element of deterrence for the United States, for Taiwan, and for other countries going forward.
Great. So I'll come back to you in a little while and we'll talk about your paper on international costs. But first, I want to ask Joel about some of the points in his paper. And Joel, you wrote a really thought-provoking analysis of the military costs, the risks for Chinese decision makers in using different levels of force against Taiwan. And I'd really like to dig into this paper a bit. So you evaluated the costs and risks by assessing the impact in 3 areas. So what were those 3 areas and why did you choose them?
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Bonnie. So this was a sort of an exercise in speculation about how China's decision makers might think about the military implications if they go down any of these paths. And the point I was trying to make is that they're not just thinking through whether or not they would win and lose on the tactical level or on the battlefield. They have to think through broader implications for the ability of the military to do their job. And so I broke that down into kind of 3 angles. The first was whether or not if they fought and lost, would they be able to perform other cross-strait missions? So, for example, if you carried out a blockade and you suffered some losses, would you be able to resume the blockade later? Would you be able to do an island landing? So your ability to operate in future scenarios kind of weighs on whether you take action in the first place. The second is the fact that the PLA has a lot of other kind of non-Taiwan missions and duties that are still very important. So if you think about things such as sea lane security or stability on the Korean Peninsula, actions across the Himalayan border with India, so many different missions that the PLA has to be able to do. And so if you're going to order them into a huge war, you have to consider, is that going to deplete your ability to protect your borders and to safeguard your imports and other such things? So that would also weigh. And then the third aspect is what I would call political military. And so in this respect, it's not so much the level of damage to the PLA, it's whether or not a debacle or a humiliation would create instability between the military and the civilian party leadership, whether it's Xi Jinping or somebody else. And in some cases, the party leadership may frame a defeat in a way that looks good. So they would say, well, we taught Taiwan a lesson and that was our goal all along. But if you have a huge undeniable loss, then you can't really put a fig leaf on that. And the military may revolt. They may say, we disagree with the civilian leaders. And so you have to consider that aspect as well when you order these people into battle. And so I tried to calculate what those implications may be across the three different scenarios.
So, Joel, we gave you obviously a minor conflict scenario and a major conflict scenario, and you added an intermediate scenario, which is a full blockade of Taiwan combined with a missile campaign against critical military sites. And in that scenario, you posited that China suffers greater losses than it anticipated and decides to withdraw because Beijing is no longer confident in its ability to achieve its objectives. So what are the lessons that the PLA learns in this scenario?
Well, first of all, one of the reasons for doing this scenario is because it seems rather realistic. If you look at the recent training exercises of the PLA, it's all about encircling Taiwan and using the Navy and the Coast Guard and others to try to, create kind of a quasi blockade. And so I thought, well, what would the decision making be to go into this? What I postulated here was that the blockade failed mainly because of foreign intervention. And I suspected that if China's ships started disappearing, mainly because they were attacked, that China would lose confidence in its ability to go a step further. And so the real logic here is that a blockade can make life very difficult on Taiwan, but it cannot guarantee a decisive victory because you still have a regime standing. And if the blockade starts to falter because somebody's challenging it, you can't really escalate up to a full invasion because of the prospect that that also will fail. And so the real lesson for the PLA in this circumstance is if you start going down this path, it's probably because you understated the likelihood that the United States or others would join in a counter blockade operation. And so that was the fundamental miscalculation for China. They were too optimistic in thinking they could do this without having to face anybody else. And once they started to face those real costs on the battlefield, it became untenable and they weren't willing to go that final distance to a full invasion.
In the major war scenario, a full-fledged invasion of Taiwan, you warn that following what is a humiliating defeat, that Beijing would be tempted to rebuild, to rearm, and relaunch the war. And of course, that could be a matter of years. And I left me wondering whether you think that there are steps that can be taken to avoid that from happening in the event that Beijing suffers this very serious defeat. So what are the policies that the United States then should pursue to prevent China from launching another attack and ensuring that the war really is terminated?
Well, I think that my view is that if China starts an invasion and then backs off and loses, that's a very dangerous period of time for the region and for broader stability. So this is not a period which we can just, sort of declare victory and, peace resumes. Um, China will have been humiliated. And so I think part of the answer for them would be to judge what the U.S. intention is. So if they say that, well, the U.S. is not stopping at the water's edge, that they're coming for the leadership in Beijing, I think we have to remember that they have all sorts of strategic capabilities. And if they sense that the regime is about to fall, then they have a lot of different ways to really create trouble for us. So long-range precision missiles, nuclear capabilities, space and cyber, et cetera. And so I think being prudent about how far you're willing to push in that circumstance is very, very important. The other piece of the equation, though, is, what would they do in the future? I think that if they try and fail, they're going to reconstitute their forces. I don't think there's any way to dissuade them from doing that. I don't think that you want to create some sort of 1919 style humiliation because that could prompt them to come back 20 years later and seek total victory against you. So you have to take the lessons of the past into consideration. But the good news is that this is an opportunity, I think, for the United States to really pull together a real coalition. I mean, because what would have happened is just a massive damaging crisis provoked by China involving many thousands of casualties against Taiwan. And so you would see regional opinion really, I think, starting to shift against China. This would be the moment to create this, sort of alliance structure to defend Taiwan. I think you have to take that kind of opportunity to prevent China from having the option to go in the future. So you don't want to be complacent. But on the other hand, avoiding provoking China or thinking that their leadership is truly in trouble, that I think necessarily has to be part of the equation as well.
You mentioned earlier the possibility of severely damaged party-army relations. Do you think that Xi Jinping's crackdown on corruption and the PLA and the purges suggests that scenario is it really is likely, that in the event again of a major defeat that can't be hidden from the Chinese public, that there is a possibility, I think you used the term earlier, that the army revolts basically against the party. I find this really fascinating. I just wonder if in your study and your own research, if you have if you sense that there is growing, intensifying friction between the party and the military.
Well, there's certainly friction, and that's historically been the case because the military is a self-contained and very insular bureaucracy in China, and Xi Jinping is basically fighting a battle to clean them up and to focus them on their mission. And of course, that's led to a lot of resentment because it's smashing iron rice bowls that these people are profiting from. And so there are people in the PLA, I think, with an intense dislike and distrust because it's affecting their lives. In a Taiwan contingency, I think, there is a possibility, especially if you have a huge national humiliation of China, of the PLA, that someone's got to get blamed for that. And either it's Xi Jinping blaming the generals for not doing their jobs, or it's the generals blaming Xi Jinping for throwing them into a battle that they weren't prepared for. And so I think you could see a circling of the wagons in the PLA against someone who they don't necessarily like all the time and who has been getting inside their business. Their mess kit has been thoroughly sort of violated by Xi Jinping. And so this could be the opportunity for those resentments in civil relations in China to really come to the fore. And so I think that's a danger that probably weighs on someone like Xi Jinping even prior to ordering them into the battle in the first place. What would his control over the military look like if things were to go badly? Could he spin this as some sort of a victory? Could he not? And I think that really speaks to his desire to maintain power. And if he thinks it doesn't, then he may not order them in the first place.
That's really a great point. You maintain in the paper that the anticipation of U.S. intervention is key to Chinese decision making. So, can you unpack that a little bit for us? How does that variable play out in these scenarios?
Well, I think the prospect of U.S. intervention is really the most important military variable in China's calculus. And the reason is that the military balance of power across the Taiwan Strait has really shifted. And so if you're looking at the quantity of capabilities, the quality, China going after Taiwan in isolation is increasingly feasible for the PLA, even if they're an island, even if they have mountains and other such obstructions. The PLA probably can overwhelm them in some circumstances. So the real question is whether or not the US gets involved, because the US has the capability to really put the hurt on the PLA, to make it impossible to sustain the blockade, to make it impossible to move all of these troops across the straits, to sustain them, to allow them to, to do their job. It's really the US that would make it difficult. And so China's impression of whether the US is likely to get involved, I think, is critical to their decision making. Part of, I think, what plays into that is their impression of whether they have a solution to this problem. And they have been building military forces to try to counter US intervention for many years. The problem with that is that you get into this almost like Pearl Harbor type scenario where you have to go big and large against your major opponent, and that actually draws them in. And so it's problematic. The other thing they're thinking about right now is what Xi Jinping calls strategic deterrence. And so the idea of this is that you're using these nuclear forces and space and cyber and what have you, not so much to fight the US, but to deter the US from wanting to get involved. And so to me, the thing that I worry about the most is that someone like Xi Jinping gets very confident that he can actually just basically wave some flags around and convince a political decision-making class in Washington just to sit this one out. Because if you're confident like that, then you get to be like, let's say, Putin in 2022. No boots on the ground, no no-fly zones. They're not really coming. It'll be a proxy war at best. And that gives you confidence because that's the battle that you want. It's small, it's finite. I don't think that's where Xi Jinping is right now. I think they still judge U.S. intervention to be very likely, which is one reason they've been so cautious. But in the future, maintaining deterrence, maintaining the at least likelihood, if not probability, that somebody, U.S. allies in addition, could get involved, I think maintaining that likelihood from China's point of view is really central to deterrence.
Great analysis, Jill. Thanks. Zack, I'll turn to you to talk about your paper, which examines the international costs that China could face in these two scenarios that we considered. And I'll start about asking you which countries and organizations would be likely to impose costs on China. Obviously, there would be part of the world, many countries that would side perhaps with China, not necessarily, of course, with the United States, and others might want to sit this out. So what's your analysis there?
I think that's right, Bonnie. A lot of countries might look at this similar to the way that a lot of countries have looked at Russia's invasion of Ukraine and just decide, look, this isn't our problem. And they might therefore decide that they don't want to take any position on the conflict, or maybe they make some very minor diplomatic statements. So when you think about which countries are most likely to respond to the diplomatic arena, I think it all begins with the United States. For obvious reasons, the U.S. is sort of the ringleader of the effort to help Taiwan. And of course, as Joel was just saying, we don't know exactly what U.S. policy might be in the future. But I think the diplomatic responses would be centered on the United States. And then you can think of sort of a concentric circle of countries operating outward from that. So the next one that I would think about is the Group of Seven, the G7 countries, key U.S. allies and countries that are often pretty willing to stand up for international rules and norms, although those are certainly being tested today. So I would think the G7 would be the next most likely to make some strong diplomatic actions. And then after that, a broader range of industrial democracies. So you could think about whether perhaps Australia or South Korea and others, perhaps in Europe, would step in and support either the US or the G7 more broadly in some of their actions. But then after that, I think, as you noted, it gets a little harder, right? A lot of countries are either going to be strictly neutral, meaning that they never take any positions on disputes, or that they might just prefer to stay non-aligned. I think that applies to a lot of countries in East Asia. They will not want to get pressured by China or the United States to take any position on a Taiwan contingency, and may therefore stay quite quiet. And then finally, you've got Chinese partners or allies, North Korea, Iran, if it still has the same government whenever this situation occurs, Pakistan and others, who are probably going to look at any contingency and think that they're going to lean towards China. Now, again, how much action might they take? I think that's less clear, but I think those are roughly the 6 different groups of countries that I would be thinking about.
In your paper, you developed 5 broad categories of possible diplomatic action. So I'll just list what those were. They're bilateral diplomatic steps, multilateral actions by international institutions, actions specifically targeting Chinese elites, diplomatic actions with security implications, and then finally limits on Chinese business activities overseas. And you put together this great list of what could be done in each of those categories. So which actions do you believe would have a high or very high likelihood of being taken in this major war scenario in which there's a full-scale Chinese invasion of Taiwan?
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, we're guessing here, but I do think we have a little bit of data to go off of because we have other conflicts and we know whether these sorts of actions have been taken in those conflicts. And of course, as all of us know, China-Taiwan conflict would be very different than, say, Russia-Ukraine. But at least we can gather some data about what might happen in the international community. So in a major war scenario, the items that I thought were, for example, the most likely, the very high likelihood, would be travel warnings for people going to Taiwan or to China from a lot of other countries. Certainly some critical public statements from some countries, perhaps some bans on arms exports to China in a major war. Those seem almost certain to me. We don't know exactly which countries would do them, but I think as you go out that concentric circle, I would think the US, the G7, a lot of advanced industrial democracies would be looking to take those types of actions. As I'm sure you're about to point out, that doesn't mean that they're going to be perceived as particularly costly on the Chinese side. Travel warnings to China, I think, are probably not perceived as very costly at all. Public statements may be annoying, but not much more than that. But there are some actions that are maybe not quite as likely, but I think are a little bit more costly to Beijing. So, for example, the evacuation of non-combatants from China is possible, and I think Chinese might see that as a bit more costly. Another example is the possibility that the assets of Chinese leaders might be frozen. Right? It might not fundamentally alter their decisions, but if you think about what happened in Hong Kong when Carrie Lam's assets were frozen, it was a pretty challenging situation for her for some time. And so there would be some actions that I think would be quite frustrating to the Chinese. I guess what gives me pause, and I'll stop here, is I just don't know how much the Chinese would predict some of these actions beforehand and how much it would change Xi Jinping's decision-making in advance. But I think if we were actually in a major conflict, trying to manage the dozens of international responses would probably overwhelm even the Chinese foreign ministry, and they would find themselves really struggling to deal with some of the consequences of a large military operation.
And of course, it's not only the actions that are taken, but it's which countries and how large that set is of countries. And I do think that the Chinese worry about coalitions of large numbers of countries taking actions, even if the action itself is not that significant. But if you have a very large number of countries taking them, then it might give them pause. So, do you conclude from the fact that China might not see these actions taken as very costly, and most of your list is actions that you think China will not be overly concerned about. But do you therefore think that even if countries are willing to take such actions and they signal in advance that they're willing to do so, which is very important, things like financial sanctions, do you think that that would then be insufficient to deter China, which is really what we're trying to do here?
I do think they probably would be insufficient to deter China on their own, but I'll admit that I think I was looking at, of the four categories that we examined, I was probably looking at the ones that are of the least concern to the Chinese leadership at the outset. I mean, I don't know what you and Joel think, but I would expect that, the military dynamics would be very important to Xi Jinping. The economic dynamics should probably be very important. I'm not sure exactly how important they would be in his thinking. And certainly the domestic political dynamics would be central. International diplomatic costs, they're a factor. I would just think that they would be the least important of those factors. But what I would note there is, the five categories that you mentioned, I tried to assess the scope of responses, the scale, the speed, and sustainability across those five. And I think when you look at a bilateral diplomatic response set, it would be broad, it would be pretty extensive, they would come on fast, and they might be sustainable over the long term. Same with elite targeting by other countries. These could be really costly actions, but as you sort of noted in the question, I'm not sure whether the Chinese leadership would perceive them to be costly enough at the outset to fundamentally shape their decision making. I think these would be secondary or tertiary concerns at the beginning. Once we're into the conflict, they might actually become quite important, but probably secondary to the military and economic dynamics.
You identify only one potential action that China would likely perceive as very costly, and that's the signing of a treaty alliance with Taiwan. And of course, that's something that is hard to imagine in current circumstances. But if you were to talk about a major invasion, I mean, there were a lot of things might be considered certainly by the United States. I don't think other countries would act before the US, but if the US actually did that, I don't know, maybe other countries would consider, especially we're talking about here a potentially prolonged conflict. But you do state that action, the likelihood of it, even in a major war, is low. So why do you think that's the only action that China would perceive as costly? And do you want to say anything else about that particular scenario?
I think that one is so important because if you imagine a failed military operation, as Joel was saying earlier, I would expect that the Chinese would want to maintain the ability to do another military operation down the line. And if the US or say Japan were to explicitly commit to a treaty alliance with Taiwan, that would be a fundamental threat to China's theory of victory. And look, it's hard to imagine right now the United States entering again into a formal treaty alliance with the Republic of China that as we used to have. But if you think before the Korean War, when we drew the Atchison line and decided that Korea was outside the US defense perimeter, and then the war started and we decided that not only was Korea inside the defense perimeter, but that we were actually going to make a treaty alliance with South Korea, there's some precedence for this. And I think from the Chinese standpoint, that would have to be seen as an incredibly costly impact of any contingency. Now, I've suggested elsewhere that I think there's some real downsides to the US or other countries entering into a formal treaty alliance with Taiwan. And in part, it may extend the length of a conflict, right? The Chinese side would then have less reason to end a conflict. But look, as a Republican, I think you would hear a lot of Republicans and probably a fair number of Democrats saying, how can the US expend huge amounts of blood and treasure in support of a country that we don't have a treaty alliance with? And they would be pushing very hard for the US to make that sort of treaty alliance explicit. And I think that is one of the real risks of a failed conflict from the Chinese point of view.
So last question for you, Zach. You argue that, and I'll quote here, the longer deadlier and more destructive a conflict over Taiwan, the more likely China is to face serious international consequences. And therefore, Chinese policymakers should take international costs seriously as they consider their military options in the Taiwan Strait. So elaborate on that. I think it's a really important point.
Yeah, I think all of us have done work on the idea of the possibility of a protracted conflict over Taiwan. And my personal view is that if the US is involved in a cross-strait conflict, it is likely to be very protracted. And so I think there's a risk that leaders in Washington or Taipei, and especially in Beijing, assume that any conflict would be short and sharp and over in a few days or weeks, in which case these other costs, frankly, are not that important, right? If you don't even have time for a diplomatic response, it's not clear how much it matters. I think you see this in the case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia probably thought this would be over and done with pretty quickly. International sanctions and other responses would therefore be minimal. But a protracted war has lots of time for these sorts of responses and many more costs. And so if I were sitting in Zhongnanhai, I'd be pretty worried that a conflict might extend, not for weeks, but for months or for years. And that the types of costs that they will have to pay, therefore, are not just the short-term military costs of a conflict, but as you note throughout this piece, all kinds of different economic, military, political, and diplomatic costs. And I think if you put that all together, it's a really challenging picture sitting from, if you were sitting in Beijing, to manage all of those challenges all at once, and to think also about how to conclude a war in an acceptable way. So if I were sitting in China trying to think about this sort of scenario, it would tell me, look, this is an incredibly risky set of decisions to take, and the bar should be probably higher than some people think it is today.
So I want to just remind everyone that the report, which is called If China Attacks Taiwan, can be found on the GMF website. It's gmfus.org. And what we do in this report is to examine the potential consequences for China if a military operation against Taiwan were to fail. So the goal was not to estimate how many casualties there would be in a conflict, but to understand the impact of a conflict possibly on the Chinese economy, the Chinese military, social stability in China, and the international costs that China would face. I'm really grateful to all of the authors. And of course, today, our guests are Zack Cooper, who's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and Joel Wuthnow, who's a senior research fellow in the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at National Defense University. And thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Okay, thanks, Bonnie.